I'm going to talk to you all about making pouring vessels today. Pouring vessels are some of my favorite things to make out of clay. I'm using a fair amount of clay here. This is probably close to 4 pounds, which could make a pretty big pouring vessel. Opening up a wide, flat bottom, thinking about pulling this up into a tall cylinder shape. I'm going to go back and forth with my sponge on the inside now and spend a few minutes compressing the floor so that it has the same density as the walls do, or else it could crack upon drying and firing. I'm going back and forth at least 20 times, applying pressure, making sure that it's also flat and level and clean at the same time. And now I'm going to start to pull it up in the air, and as I do, right from the beginning, I'm going to pull it inward in this kind of tapered cone shape. So I'm really dominating with my sponge. I want the pouring vessel to be more narrow at the top than at the base. I want it to have a strong sense of containment. Also important, at the end of each pull, I'm going to use my sponge and press down on the rim, and I want to keep this rim fat because I'm going to pull my spout out of this thickness of clay. I would say the biggest mistake I see people make when trying to pull a spout from the rim is they just don't have thick enough clay at the rim, and they wind up either ripping it or making something that just looks kind of skimpy and wimpy and insufficient. It's hard to train yourself to leave that extra thickness at the top after you've been working so hard to thin it out so much. But right up there, I just don't apply any pressure up there except to actually press down and thicken it up. This is a pretty big cylinder and the clay is mostly pulled up in the air. However, I know that trimming this is going to be, like I said, a big challenge because I'm going to make it higher on one side than on another side. So to help with that whole process, the first thing you could do is just not leave as much clay down there to trim. Like, the trimming will be a lot easier if there's not very much to do. So I'm going to do some extra moves right down here at the bottom. You can see how I'm scraping the bat with my sponge, and I'm really going to focus on getting all that clay up in the air because trimming is going to be hard enough already, and I don't want to be in a situation where I have to do a lot of it. As I come up now, I'm also starting to swell out the shape of the pitcher. I'm gradually applying more pressure with my inside hand, and my outside sponge hand is just in more of a guiding role or a supporting role. And I'll show you the position of my fingers as I come out. I'm kind of using the pads of these first 3 fingers and a bit of the side of my index finger. Okay, as I come up here from the base, I have to be mindful that I don't jut it out or start to swell it out too abruptly. Right here, if I come out too abruptly, it'll start to collapse. So I really focus on controlling the curve of the piece and making it gradual down at that bottom part of the curve. Now I'm giving it a little bit more pressure with my inside hand, stretching it a bit more. And now as I come back up into the neck area, I'm going to have my outside or my sponge hand start to dominate to keep it narrow at the top. So as I come up the length of this piece, my left hand or my right hand are dominating at different various times. If you feel like the top is starting to get too wide, you want to do some what's called collaring. Collaring is when you apply all your pressure from the outside only. And I kind of gently squeeze it in, and as I come up, I release pressure. Again, I'll start a little bit lower than where I actually want it to really narrow, and I'm applying pressure, squeezing it in, slowly coming up and releasing pressure gradually. If it's really thin, you're going to be limited on how much collaring you can do. I usually like to keep this just narrow enough that I can still stick my hand down in there. Of course, when you're actually throwing it, you probably have the worst possible view of your piece because you're sitting right on top of it. What you need to do to really evaluate the shape is lean back or bend over and look at the profile of it. I'm going to use the rib to refine the curves. I can kind of see down here there's a little bulge maybe, and then an indentation, and then it comes out in this middle part. And I want to have that be more flowing, more continuous, again, more elegant as it comes up into the piece. The rib is a great tool to help control curves. I'm holding this on a curve with my right hand, and my left hand on the inside is going to gently push the clay wall into the edge of the rib. And I'm going to alternate back and forth as I come up the length of this piece. I think about the shoulder, and I think about the neck, and I think about how the spout is going to emerge from there, whether I'm pulling it out from a thick rim or a separate spout that I'm adding on. Where is it going to fit? And on the opposite side of the spout is going to be a handle, and where is that going to fit, and how is that going to engage with this form? So I've already kind of, maybe you can tell by the shape of this, I've already kind of set it up, anticipating a spout and a handle addition. Don't try and pull a spout from the rim right when you're done throwing it. I know it's really tempting to just do it right now. The clay is so soft, and maybe you just want to get to that next step, but there's no way that I wouldn't totally mess this up if I did that. I need to let it dry, depending on the weather outside, depending on how much water you use when you threw it. Just sitting out in normal conditions, I would say leave it totally uncovered, maybe a few hours, and check and see if it's at the right point then. So I'm not going to do it now, and I also don't want to slide this piece off of this bat because it's so large and so fragile. I think if I slid it off of here onto another board, I'd mess it up also. So I am going to run my wire underneath it to loosen it from the bat, but I'm just going to leave it in place, and I'm going to let this sit for a few hours. Okay, here's another piece that I threw that's been sitting out and drying for about 2 hours outside. It's still soft, but it's just stiff enough that I can pick it up and not mess it up. It's the perfect degree of softness where it's soft enough that I can still pull a spout from the rim, but it's just firm enough that I can trim the bottom. And the good thing is that I threw it in a way where there's really not very much to trim at all. I'm going to use that trick where I make a mark on one side, holding still, use some kind of marking tool like your pin tool or your thumbnail or this wood stick, and I'm holding still and letting the piece bump against me. And so I know where that scratch mark is that the pot is sticking out too far on that side. So I'm going to nudge it away from the mark or bring the mark a little bit more onto center. And I definitely want to clean up this floor area. Starting from the bullseye, I'm going to sweep across to the 3 o'clock position. I also want to make sure that I leave this bottom slightly lower in the middle section than out here towards the edge. So I'm going to make it slightly concave so that it won't wobble on the table. I'm smoothing back out the trimming marks so that it's a continuously smooth surface. And I'm smoothing especially down at the very bottom because I really want it to look finished where it makes contact with the table. And I'm smoothing across the floor here because I know that's a spot that people are also going to see when they use this piece. If your piece is at all taller on one side or thicker on one side, that's the side you definitely want to put the spout on. And I think this is just slightly taller and thicker over here than on the other side. It's the same kind of wet stretching of clay that you do when you're pulling a cylinder wall up in the air. I'm going to use a lot of water and let my fingers glide over the surface because I don't want to tug the clay, I want to glide across the clay. My left hand is going to be doing a lot of supporting and stabilizing over on the back side of the spout also. And then when I feel like it's ready, I'm going to start to pull up. Now, of course, you are going to have a different hand position when you do this than I have right now. It depends on the shape and size of your piece and obviously the shape and size of your fingers. But I'm going back and forth again across an area about 2 or 3 inches wide. And I'm not just pulling on the very top edge itself, I'm going down into the neck area. To go outward, I'm going to use my left hand and keep it contained or kind of establishing sort of a throat area on either side of this spout. And I'm going to use my right index finger and go back and forth. Keep getting a little bit of height and then using my left hand to hold it back while I go side to side. If this throat area gets too wet or too thin, it's usually a combination of both of those two things, then it's going to start to collapse in there, it's going to start to warp and wobble, and it's going to look insufficient. Sometimes to give a spout more definition, I like to come on either side and define the throat a little bit more by pressing in right here and on the other side too. And that helps to further set aside the spout from the rest of the neck of the piece. It gives it some definition, it makes it look more prominent, and I just think it's a great shape shifter on the piece. I usually like to come pretty down far into the body of the piece and start to stretch it out way down far. I also find that doing that helps to actually almost like separate the channel of liquid that's going to come out of here from the rest of the mass of liquid. If you can give it a longer and broader throat area, it helps it pour more cleanly and not having it just all gush out at once. And I also like to focus on the shape of the mouth itself. And this is a shape I really like to design in my pieces. This kind of kidney shape or jelly bean shape or whatever yours particularly looks like. Obviously, you're going to be looking at it while you're working on the piece because you're looking at it from the top down, but the end user is going to see that profile of the piece a lot also every time they look down and pick it up and pour out of it. And it's just a really nice feature in the piece where you can demonstrate your control. Take a look at this outline shape of the mouth. Sometimes I like to give the throat area even a little bit more punch than this and press into it with some kind of a mark-making stick. So I'm just drawing up the side of the throat with my stick. And if you feel like it's getting too soft while you're doing this, you can always just stop and let it firm up again. Let it sit for an hour and let the surface water dry off of it. Clean and dry your hands off, and that might help you finish it. You don't have to do it all at once. It's a really good idea to have the spout be slightly higher than the rest of the rim. Not just stick out further, but also have it be higher up. Because when you pick up this piece to pour, What is vertical right now is going to be more horizontal, okay? So we need to think about the flow dynamics of the piece when it's in this position. And when it's in this position, what was high is now going to be sticking out further, like how you want. If you don't make the spout higher, then when you go to pour, it could actually wind up pouring back behind itself instead of streaming forward into the cup, which is going to be right here. Another nice way to deal with the bottoms of your pieces and the kind of issue with having to trim a piece that's going to have a spout on it is to make pieces that don't have a floor on them at all when you throw, and then attach a slab bottom on afterwards. You won't have to trim your pieces at all, which sounds great if trimming is not your favorite thing to do. This is a big cylinder I made, and when I opened it up, when it was first just that solid mound of clay and I stuck my thumb in there to open it up, instead of stopping and leaving, you know, like a ½ inch floor, I just went all the way down to the bat. And then when I spread it open, my fingers or my thumb were scraping along the bat. And so I threw this to be a hollow tube. I threw it without a floor on it at all. I didn't cut it when I was done throwing it, which was about 2 hours ago, sitting out. Now I'm going to cut it. It's stiffened up just enough, but it's still somewhat pliable, and you can see the absence of a floor. So there's really not much to trim at all. There's maybe a little bit of extra thickness on the inside that I can just carve out with the metal knife from the toolkit. And then I have a slab here that I've let firm up slightly, and I'm going to cut it to the right shape that I want and slip and score attach it. You can pretty easily change your piece to be in an oval shape, which might be nice for a pouring vessel with a spout on one side and a handle on the other. This would really give it a more dynamic quality. Of course, your piece has to be just the right stiffness or softness to do this, or I could probably make it into more of a square shape if I paddle it in on 4 sides, maybe give it 4 corners. You obviously wouldn't be able to do this with a piece thrown the traditional way because the floor would be holding it in its circular shape. But throwing things without a floor can really open up a lot of possibilities. So I've slipped and scored the bottom edge of the pot, and I've slipped and scored this top edge of the slab that's going to be the floor. Usually I'll give it a few kind of drops or pats on the table to get some initial compression of those score marks that I want to engage with each other. You also definitely have to go on the inside with a soft coil of reinforcing clay and go around that joint and seal it up with this clay and use this reinforcing clay coil as an opportunity to compress the joint that you've made down in there. So I put that coil in all the way around on the joint, and now I'm going around with my thumb back and forth across that clay, that new soft clay I added in there, and I'm melding it in place. You don't want there to be any evidence, either visual or tactile evidence, that there was a seam or a joint there. You want it to feel and look completely smooth and finished on the inside, or else it's very likely to crack as it dries and gets fired in the kiln. So do a really good job of attaching it, not just on the inside, but of course on the outside too. I'm going to finish all of this in a clean, smooth manner and make it look finished. Even though I didn't trim this piece in the traditional way, I still want it to have a clean, smooth bottom. But doing it this way for me is frankly a lot easier often than trimming would be. So this rim is not thick enough to pull a spout out of it. Instead, I'm going to make a spout separately and add it on. So out of a slab of clay, I'm going to cut a shape that is symmetrical from left to right and is in kind of a broad arc. This is just a rough outline to start with, and I'm going to give it a little bit of a curve and hold it up there and see what it looks like. Well, I can tell already that's just way too big, so I'm going to cut it down some more. You know, of course, it's always easier to cut more off, but once you've cut too much, then that gets a lot trickier to add more back on, or in this case, I would have to roll out a new slab. So I'm going to cut off a little bit at a time and kind of get a sense of the size and shape that I want. Got this just the right softness so that I can bend it, but it's stiff enough so that I can do it and not leave a bunch of fingerprints all over it. Making a spout out of a slab is in large part about how do you finish that edge. Because I think nothing looks more kind of sharp and unfinished than the side of an edge that you just cut with the metal knife from your toolkit. That's never the line that I want to have on one of my pots. I want it to be smooth and rounded and finished. I'm also going to do a little bit of pulling on this slab. I'm going to give it a little bit of that wet, stroked look to it. Maybe I can even stretch out a little bit more length to it. And you can see that I'm curving it too. So my spout is curved, not just this way, but it's also slightly curved this way to give it more a sense of a flow from the piece, to make it look less stiff. So as I'm shaping that vertical curve of the spout, I'm thinking about how it's going to look on this profile here, this kind of under the throat area. I want to be really elegant or aerodynamic or just a really considered feature of this entire shape. And I can probably shape it and pull it a bit more once it's attached, so I'll go ahead and show you about attaching it. But I call this shape kind of like a Pringles potato chip that curves this way as well as curving this way. It has a double curve to it. So I'm going to hold it in place and lightly trace around with the tip of my knife. And I'm going to go ahead and cut that U-shaped section out of the wall of my piece. Actually, I'm going to cut slightly on the inside, probably about a ½ inch inside of that. Again, because you can always cut more off if you need to. And I want to have a little section there that I actually have something to slip and score and attach this onto. And again, you definitely want to come with a coil of soft clay and get it in there and work that in, meld that in place so that there is no evidence that this was a separate piece of clay that was added on. You don't want to be able to see that it was added on, and you don't want to be able to feel that it was something separate added on. And if you can work the joint that way, then you know that it's going to be strong. And I'm going to clean it up on the outside too. And then I'm going to spend some more time shaping it once it's attached. With wet fingertips, I'm going around that cut edge and rounding it, making it smooth and soft, making it look finished. I want it to have the same kind of smooth, round finish that the rest of this wheel throwing rim has. I don't want it to look like I just cut it with my knife out of a slab. I'm shaping the spout outward more, again, holding it back with fingers of my left hand and moving back and forth with a wet finger on the inside. And I'm going to work for a while right on these two attachment points here on the rim. I want there to be a sense of flow or a sense of continuity between the rim and where it flows up into the spout. I want this to have a good amount of upward lift to it so that when I pick it up to pour out of it, again, I want it to pour outward away from its body. You don't want to have a spout that just sticks out horizontal, because then when you do pick it up to pour, it'll wind up pouring back behind itself. You want there to be a little bit of upward lift to it and to have the peak of the spout be the tallest point of the pot. You can put spouts on bowls also. If you think of a mixing bowl, a batter bowl, a pouring bowl, we use spouted bowls sometimes for putting like a homemade salad dressing on the table, or a gravy boat are all forms of spouted bowls. So here's a pretty simple, straightforward bowl that I made, and I'm gonna go ahead and trim it first. And this is another case where I'm gonna add a spout on afterwards, as opposed to pulling a spout out from a thick rim. I'm just gonna clean it up on the bottom, but I do wanna make sure that it's slightly lower in the middle so that it's not wobbly. And I'm gonna trim away a little bit of extra weight here, reveal a little bit more the curve of the bowl. So another way to make a spout separately and add it on is throw a little cylinder and cut it open, and to use this as the spout. This is just a teeny cylinder about the size and shape of a shot glass. And I'm gonna start by cutting the bottom off completely. So now I just have a tube, and then I'm gonna take that tube and I'm gonna open it up at the top. I'm gonna slice it open and open it up. Now I've got the start of my spout. I'm gonna take these two edges, which are cut really straight right now, and I'm gonna cut them on a curve. Where it's gonna attach onto the side of the pot, I'm gonna go ahead and cut that section out to get the right shape and the right sense of flow. What I like about throwing spouts is that you can capture the energy of the throwing rings on the piece. I love taking a thrown element and turning it on its side, or taking a thrown element and cutting it open and laying it down like a slab, or using it in a different way and letting those throwing rings speak in a different way. Still talk about speed and talk about pressure and the malleability of the clay, but do it at a different dynamic on the piece. Can really bring a fun energy to your work. Again, I think the important thing with cutting the edges of elements that you're adding on is to go back over those cut edges with wet fingertips and smooth them and soften them. Don't just leave them cut and sharp. This is one of our favorite pouring vessels that we have with a pulled spout. I love this piece. I love how much height he was able to get by pulling this extra thickness of clay on the rim up in the spout area. And I feel like just the shape of it here and the curved line of the spout coming around is especially beautiful. I also really appreciate the oval shape that he's brought to the mouth, and slightly distorting the neck area to make this an oval instead of a circle like the rest of the piece. And of course, I love how the rim just flows beautifully down into the handle. And I also really appreciate the slight flare at the foot and how that kind of echoes this neck area coming up to the rim. This is another one of our favorite pouring vessels that we have with a pulled spout. I especially like this edge that he brought down slightly lower than the actual rim, and how the handle kind of sticks or seems to emanate from that edge. To me, this acts like a shoulder on the piece, and the handle becomes like an arm that comes from that shoulder point. I also really like the spout on this one. I like the shape of the mouth and how the spout comes from it. This piece does a great job of pouring, partly because the handle is up so high on the body. It's easy just to tilt it in space, and I really like the size of this piece. We use this one sometimes for sauces or large quantities of salad dressing, and it's just a nice functional size and shape to have on the table. This is one of my favorite pouring vessels we have, with a spout made by a slab that's been attached on. And I feel like making a slab spout is the way to get the largest possible spout for your piece. It's pretty easy to go wide and tall with a slab, and it gives the piece a great dynamic quality. On this piece, I also really like how she's further played up that dynamic quality with the drawings kind of carving through layers of slip and underglaze on this piece, and the way these vines and leaves kind of spring up into air, I feel echo this kind of springboard of a spout and springboard of a handle that do a nice job of balancing each other out on this really exciting picture. Here's a pouring vessel we have where the spout was made by part of a separately thrown cylinder that's been cut and added onto the side of the piece. On this one, the spout is played up with a different color, and how that color is integrated through the rim, inside the piece, and down through the handle. And it creates kind of a cohesiveness to these three separate elements: body, spout, and handle. And they're kind of all tied together through that color shift. The spout's pretty big, and it has kind of a geometric quality to it, how it's been cut in this kind of step down manner. So there's a lot of fun things you can do with throwing your spout separately and then cutting apart these little teeny thrown cylinders and piecing them onto the body in different creative ways. So I've joined this pretty well on the inside. On the outside, as I come around and seal and smooth this joint, I want to make sure that I also just pay attention to the shape of this throat area here, to this kind of U-like shape here, and make sure that that is integrated into the overall design of the piece. So as I run my finger back and forth across this joint to compress the clay, I'm also, not just looking at the surface of the clay, but looking at the shape of the clay. And I want to make sure that there's the same kind of symmetry to this as echoed in the rest of the piece. I can just do some kind of fine tuning and shaving of that edge once it gets to the next stage of dryness. Lots of times when you're throwing a cylinder, you might have one side of the cylinder be taller than the other side of the cylinder. This is a sign that the clay is not perfectly centered, that there's literally more clay on one side than on the other side. It's really common. The good thing is, for pouring vessels, that's a natural element to incorporate into a spout. I'm both gonna pull the spout a little bit from the high side, but just as important, I'm gonna cut it down on the low side. So I'm basically gonna cut away everything that's not spout. So I'm gonna do a series of cuts back here in these curved lines going around. Of course, this has to be just the right stiffness, because I want it to be stiff enough that I can come and cut through without smushing it up, but I still want it to be soft enough that I can do some pulling on the high side. I'm going to get a lot of water on this side to start to pull it up, and I'm going across kind of a 2 or 3 inch section of it. I'm using a light to moderate amount of pressure. Now I'm going to pull it sideways. I'm going to use the side of my right index finger, and I'm going to hold my left fingers on either side of that spout area, and I'm going to gently push it out. You want to come down into the throat area somewhat. Don't just have it at the very rim only. If you have that come down a little further into the neck and body of the piece even, you'll get a better pour with your liquid. And then on either side, I'm going to push it in just a little bit. And now I see how I could cut this back even more on the back side. And I'm going for symmetry here, so I'm going to keep turning the piece around as I continue to cut slivers off, because I want to make sure that it's even. And for me, this is the perfect softness right now to do a little smoothing and pushing and manipulating of this rim. And I think I'm gonna push back on the back side of the mouth even more and make this more of an area for a handle to emanate from. I want to give it a bit more flair around the spout. And again, some important lines that I look at when designing a pouring vessel are going to be this line right here, going down the profile of the piece, along the spout, down the throat, across the body, down into the foot of the form. And I want this to be a line that's just considered, that flows throughout the piece so that the spout looks integrated and appropriate in with the overall composition. And I also look at this line of the mouth right here from the top down, and I want to make sure that the spout looks like it's integrated and well designed from that perspective also. And I think I've got a bit more kind of cutting and smoothing to do up here, but I like the direction that it's going in. Sometimes when I add a handle onto a piece, especially a larger piece like this, I'll kind of indent the area where my knuckles are going to go. And you can see how I've flattened this back side of the pouring vessel. I can have a handle that doesn't need to stick out quite as far, doesn't need to come out quite so far into space. I can have a handle that's a little bit more into the body of the piece, that's a little shorter. It'll be stronger that way, but if I can make this part of the pot indented, I'll be able to get my fingers in there really well without having to have a handle that sticks out so far. So I'm able to make a handle that's kind of smaller, shorter, which is going to be stronger, but still has more room. On a larger pouring vessel like this, think not just about the shape of the handle, but think about the totality of the shape, which for me is handle, 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 and then it comes around and it becomes pot, 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 goes back up into the handle and circles back around into the pot. And it's this whole shape right here, the shape of the air, the negative shape, that's kind of, 2/3 handle and 1/3 pot, the shoulder of the pot, that needs to be considered as an entire shape. It's not just about the handle, in other words, it's how it's integrated in with the rest of the piece. And that also includes how it flows down into the rim up here. It also includes things like how it balances out the spout. The spout is sticking up and out on this side, and the handle's going to stick up and out on the other side in kind of a similar but a really different way. And I certainly want them to visually balance each other to create a well-balanced object overall. So I'll go ahead and slip and score attach that, and I'll go on the inside here with a little coil of reinforcing clay and fill in that crevice-like gap that's right at the joint, and I'll put a coil of really soft attaching clay underneath here also to reinforce and compress that joint. As soon as I'm done attaching the handle, I'm going to attach a slab floor on here also. So throwing things without a floor and attaching on a slab base is a great technique for pouring vessels, but especially with a piece like this that's so not level at the top. And frankly, just because of the narrowness of the top and the overall height of the piece, really tall, vertical, narrow pieces are harder to trim than wide open mouth bowls. And so for all of those reasons, throwing it without a floor and attaching a slab base could be a smart way for you to go. I think making handles is really fun. I love that kind of wet stretching, wet stroking, pulling of the clay. Probably with these pouring vessels, you're going to want to have larger handles on them than what you might be used to with maybe making handles for cups up until now. I don't know, but I'll show you how to make some larger handles. This is a pretty big piece of clay for a handle. I can make a really large handle with this. So I like to start with kind of a tapered plug or a cone shape of clay. Sometimes I call this a carrot. It's kind of a fat carrot. I'm going to roll it out and I'm going to try and get this a little closer to what the dimensions that I want my handle to actually be. I'm going to make it longer. I'm going to make it a little skinnier, but I'm going to keep it tapered. Most of the time I want my handles to be tapered also. And I think of them as like arms. And just like your arm, it's thicker up at the shoulder joint where it attaches onto your body. There's a structural reason for that. And then it tapers out to being thinner. You can actually, get it really, really close to the size, the length, the thickness, the width of what you want your handle to be, just kind of rolling it out as a coil and then tamping or flattening it out with the heel of your hand like this. You definitely want there to be some kind of flat, or I think of this as like a strap-like quality to the handle because it's a lot easier to pick up. Don't make your handles totally rounded like a crayon or like a hot dog. They're really hard to pick up when they're rounded like that. You want some flatness to them. It really minimizes how much pulling you need to do. I'm going to hold the fat end up in my left hand and keep that grip hand dry so it doesn't slide out, but the whole rest of it I'm going to get super wet to start. I try and hold my first finger and thumb in a little bit more of a oval or kind of a flattened shape like that instead of a circle to reiterate the strap-like quality of this handle. I'll also do some pulls using my first two fingers. I call this a scissors pull, but I'll go back and forth, and one thing I know for sure is that you're going to hold your hands in a different way than I'm holding my hands because everyone has different little bumps and ridges and pads on their fingers. So, just respond to what you're seeing. You also notice that I turn it over a lot. I'm rotating it in my left hand and doing the back side also. Once I've got it to what I think is a good thickness and a good width and obviously enough length, then I'll flip it over and use the back side as the part that's going to show. So you want to make sure that everything is smoothed out, especially these two side edges, that's rounded and smooth. And I do a lot of that by catching it in the webbing between my index finger and my thumb right there. And I'm certainly going to trim this even more when I attach it on, but for now, I just want it to firm up. So I'm going to set it down on my table, and if I set it just right, I can actually let it firm up in a little bit of a curve. Sometimes I like to pull handles kind of quick and messy. Maybe it's because I've done so many of them. I like to have them be a little loose sometimes and not so controlled looking. I think of handles as like practicing your signature. And I think it's only once you've, kind of practice your signature 100 times or 1,000 times are you able to do it and have it look not just carefree and easy, but have it be expressive of your personality somehow. So I think of handles in a very linear way, kind of like writing. And I think they're also very expressive. There's a lot of your energy and your touch just, left in the traces that you pull down. I guess leaving marks like this on the surface of the handle for me is like leaving evidence of throwing rings on your pots. Like it just shows the energy, it shows the softness or the stiffness of the clay. It literally shows your pressure, your touch in the material. And so when someone goes to pick that up, you know, it's like they're holding your hand, or they're sharing in that process with you. It's a way to share your love of the material and your love of manipulating it with the end user in the way that you pull the handle right there. This is just set up enough that I can touch it without leaving a bunch of schmuckety fingerprints on it, but it's still got some flexibility and pliability to it. It's soft cheese hard. Handles tend to stiffen up very quickly, and I find that they don't do well wrapped in plastic overnight. So you really want to baby the drying of them. Don't get too far ahead of time with your handles, and try and catch them at just the right moment of stiffness. The good thing is that they're also pretty quick to make. So if you miss your window of flexibility in attaching them, you can just pull some more, and probably the next batch that you pull will be better than the ones you had made before anyways. So I've got a handle that I think is going to work on this piece. I'm going to go ahead and slip and score the pot where I want to attach it. There's going to be 2 attachment points, and I always like to take a moment and hold the piece out away from me and really look at this part of the profile of it and consider what the best attachment points are going to be. I think for me it's going to be right back here at the back of the neck, and probably up here somewhere coming off of the top of the shoulder. I'm going to go ahead and slip and score those and do a really good job of slipping and scoring. Use ample water down in the score marks that you made, and just keep going. And as you keep scoring, go in multiple different directions, sideways, at an angle, at the opposite angle. I am chewing into the wall of clay. Don't just make these score marks on the outside surface only. I'm probably digging into this wall of clay at least halfway through. Okay, now I'm going to more intentionally decide where along this cross section I want the handle to actually start. It's a little thicker, as I started with a tapered plug of clay, and I want to keep some of that thickness, but you know, I don't need to have this messy end to it. So again, I just cut off a little bit at a time. Probably make it even a little bit shorter. That seems like the right size. I think about this entire shape right here, kind of circling around, and I try to make that shape as strong a shape as possible, make it integrated in with all the other shape considerations I've made about this piece. So don't just look at the shape of the handle, but look at how it's incorporated onto the back of the pot itself. And now I'm going to more thoroughly attach it into the score marks that I made. I've got my fingers inside the piece so I can really use some firm pressure and not distort the pot itself. And I like to kind of wiggle it back and forth as I shove the handle clay into the score marks that I made. And then as part of my final cleanup, I'm going to go in with a small coil of clay into this attachment spot right here, right where the handle comes into the body on the lower attachment. I'm going to put a thin coil of clay in there, and I'm going to work that in with my wood stick. Sometimes I'll use a pencil for this, and I use this to reinforce the joint. So I'm blending that attachment clay. The tip of my wood knife here does a good job of smoothing out or erasing any stray score marks. And sometimes if it seems like it needs it, I'll use a little extra coil of soft clay on this upper attachment also. It really just depends on the angle that you have the handle come into the body of the piece and how thick the handle strap is right there. But I often find there's a little crevice that could benefit from some filling in. And I'm using the wood stick to smooth that attachment clay and also kind of re-articulate the joint itself. I don't want it to look just all smeared in place. I want it to be smooth, but to have a shapely quality to it. The finished effect is subtle, but I think it's very strong. And where the handle makes physical contact with the pot, it actually gets slightly thicker right there. It slightly broadens out. It makes the handle look stronger. I've also gone back and softened it and cleaned it up with wet fingertips. There's no sharp edges left at all, and I've really cleaned up the shape of the attachment itself as it comes around the strap. And on this one, I think I want to have the handle actually come up from the rim. I think that's a pretty dynamic quality, but it's a little too stiff for me to bend it as much as I want right now. I'm afraid it's going to break. I'm going to get a little bit of extra moisture into the clay and see if I can coax it into shape. Handles are really easy to put cracks in by mistake, and unfortunately sometimes you'll put a little hairline crack into a handle or kind of cause some stress inside the handle itself that doesn't manifest until after it's gone through the first firing. So really try and get your handles in the shape that you want them while the clay is still soft. Let's see what it really looks like in space. Probably a little too big. I can cut it down a bit. Nice. That could have a handle to it that almost looks like I could hang it from a cup hook or something. That's going to be an exciting pot. Okay, so obviously I'm asking you to work in a series format for this project to strengthen your ideas, to practice your techniques. Your work for this series does not need to all be identical to each other. Obviously, it won't be. But I want you to adopt one way of making spouts and work with it so that you can get to some degree of achievement with it, and so you can really play out your design ideas in making pieces that feel right for you. There's a variety of different ways that you can make spouts and handles to enhance those pieces. I think it's a good idea to start by thinking about the kind of spout that you want to make, whether you want to pull it out from a thick rim of clay, or if you want to make it out of a separate piece of clay, whether that's a small thrown element or a shaped slab and add it on, or if you want to do some kind of hybrid version of cutting back the backside of the rim and slightly pulling out or shaping and accentuating the spout part of the rim, and how that's going to set you up to trim the pieces or finish the bottom somehow. If you're going to trim them in the traditional way, you're probably going to be trimming softer than what you're used to so that you can still do something with the rim, whether it's slip and score attaching something on or pulling out the spout from thicker clay. Or if you're going to try something like throwing a piece without a floor at all and attaching a slab bottom instead, that opens up a lot of different shape possibilities also, and is just a really fun way to work. So think about incorporating that into your workflow also. Have fun with these pieces. Spouts are fun, they're dynamic, they're super fun to use, and they're just really great versatile pieces for you to have around the house.